thank you very much for joining us this Friday morning, this rainy Friday morning for this session. And I kindly thank Jim and Chris and Rafal for accepting my invitation for the session and therefore giving me a reason to join us. Now, it is, I think, one of my very first attempts to moderate something. I've done hard work learning what moderating looks like. One thing I've understood is the prerogative of asking questions and possibly also saying whatever you want to say before you let anyone else say. But so my kind of thoughts behind the session and putting this conversation together was I realized that cybersecurity has developed into an enormously complex and I would say an area of confrontation in international affairs. And so in the intergovernmental discussions, the divide between national security prerogatives and also sovereign interests has become evident. So we all have our positions. And despite years of actually trying to figure out cybercrime, seeing more and more national security relevant cyber incidents, and of course being aware of the military capabilities being developed in this field, it's clear that governments are struggling, finding it really hard to come up with a global and a grand strategy for this. And meanwhile, I've come to understand that international organizations have for years developed a lot of guidance on cyber hygiene, on privacy, on cybercrime, security standards. So, and yet without even declaring all of the existing stuff obsolete, we are discussing about or the new roads that we need to have to make anything happen in this field. Now recently, very recently, a few days ago, I learned at the Catherine's conference in Georgetown that the US has taken the position that the present stage of cyber conflict, and the present stage, I agree, means not cyber warfare as much as it means a lot of national interests being targeted by cyber means and among other things. It's calling it a new normal. And then I thought about something, from 100 years ago, because soon after the radio equipment became the new normal, we had the discussion or kind of how not using it is negligent. So regardless of whether it's private victims or governments who suffered large-scale cyber incidents, I think one needs to figure out their own portion of this kind of cybersecurity before governments will ever be able to figure it out for the whole community or for the world, if it's possible at all. So the questions for this flash session from my side are, first, provided that the help yourself document might actually have international dimensions sooner than we expect, then how to deconflict and kind of make sense of the existing, often contradictory and overlapping national and international ambitions in this field. And then what would be the kind of next logical or required steps on the way to a coherent policy on global cybersecurity? Do we maybe need to again re-segment some of the mandates of international organizations who deal with the issue? Do we maybe need to separate technical issues from the legal issues, or do we instead have to figure out how to triangulate every issue from legal, policy, and tech perspective before we make sense of it? So how do we develop the next generation of thinkers? I know it's more than 3 questions, but then my last question, what elements or characteristics or approaches actually do you think make in the light of this complexity, make us strategic, us governments, experts, advising our governments, strategic about the threat and our own vulnerabilities, and help us establish a strong, viable position in this cyber cloud. So I give the word to you and open it up for your thoughts, and then after that we open it up for I hope very sharp and nasty questions on this. So
It's a mistake to have me go first because my brain is still somewhere between here and China. So we'll see if I say anything reasonable. That even makes sense in retrospect. This is a good topic, but there's a couple things that we might want to put in mind. There is an expanding international agenda and a series of negotiations, both at a regional and global level, that are not that well publicized. And so if I was going to be a little critical of some of the Western governments, it would be that they have not done as good a job as they could in putting out the efforts in the OSCE, in the UN, in the ASEAN Regional Forum, in other regional fora, among the Five Eyes in the G20. So there's a very intense set of negotiations going on among governments. The three issues that I think they're looking at in these are how do you create stability in cyberspace, and that's the kind of global thing I think Anthony was talking about. How do you define and constrain conflict? What are the rules for conflict, including the rules for armed conflict? There's clearly more than that. And finally, a set of trade and economic issues that largely revolve around economic espionage. Although that term in some ways is so freighted that it's difficult to use. But stability, warfare, trade, those are the issues that are being discussed now. And one of the things that has come up is there is existing practice, there is existing discussion. I think you used the word obsolete. I probably would use the word irrelevant. So a lot of the work that's been done up until now is largely irrelevant, right, to thinking about stability, warfare, trade. How do we build on it? How do we make it useful again? Part of that will be rethinking the multi-stakeholder model, which I'm actually writing a all-purpose speech for the next London process negotiation. And you have to have words like multi-stakeholder innovation. The internet is big and it's growing. These are all great ideas, and I hear them repeatedly at the ministerial level. They're not that useful, right? But in the multi-stakeholder notion, which is a firm part of the US and I'd say European position, we need to maintain the utility of the multi-stakeholder model, and that will mean adjusting in some way. So working this out, what are the rules for academics? What are the rules for the civil society? What are the roles for these entities? What are the rules for the technical community? The old model doesn't work, and so we need to rethink that model if we're going to move ahead. So I look at it as an area where, and this might be your last question, we really need to, and we were talking a little bit about this before, we really need to sharpen the research, right? If there are all these activities going on, and they are perhaps unwisely hidden by governments, how do we get information on them? How do we get a better sense of where there is emerging consensus on how warfare will be conducted in cyberspace? There is an emerging consensus on that. Even the Chinese and the Russians appear to be on board. How do we get that word out? How do we get better data collection? How do we get greater openness? So my hope is that sessions like this, and with experts like my colleagues here in Hamilton, you're an expert too, I didn't imply. If that sounded wrong, it's because my brain isn't working. How do we get a fuller public discussion of the fact that we do have a very assertive international agenda that is leading to agreement in some areas, but that has also identified some very difficult issues that will require us rethinking how we do this. So I'll stop there. So 5 minutes, right?
Don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, Chris, would you agree?
I agree. I think a lot of what Jim is putting forward. My work is largely focused, and I think more on the technical support side for customers, working with them, how to improve their security, and this is with my international customers. And the one thing that sort of resonates with me that was mentioned before was the idea of this new norm, right? That we sort of come to accept, and this is the state of affairs, and that with different countries essentially wanting to reach out for support and say, should something happen to me through some sort of like bilateral level partnership, that you should somehow support me, whether you're in a country or organization like NATO and so forth. There sort of is now a requirement that says, well, why should I support you, right? Have you done enough on your own to essentially get your own house in order, to get everything put into place? Have you really reached out in a meaningful way to help address the issues that we all know you have right now? And that gets down to one of these sort of core problems that I run into internationally, is that in cyber, in the world we live in, my customers, they don't really feel very comfortable sharing about their vulnerabilities, sharing about the exploits, sharing about how on a daily basis they're having these recurring problems. And the truth is, we're all having recurring problems every single day. It's not just them, but if they would just sort of share this information with us, we can actually help them work towards a meaningful solution and help them get their house in order such that when it comes to a point in time that a cyber incident takes place or a cyber attack takes place, however you threshold that event, and that's a separate conversation, that we really truly can say, well, we see what you've done, we know how you approach this, we have a common vocabulary so that we can really understand what you're experiencing in the same way, and now we can really feel like we can totally support you in your endeavors to help defray this attack or event or whatever it might be that's taking place against your territory, if you will. So, yes, if I was looking for the things that I really want to improve upon with my customers, it's communication of their vulnerabilities, communication of their threats, really trying to be able to share this information and know that it's okay to share within a trusted community who's there to help them out. And I will stop there and pass it.
Great, thank you, and thank you very much to Anakin and ISS for the invitation to participate in the panel. I'll keep it rather brief and short. I'd say that I pretty well agree with everything that Jim said, in the sense that I think that anything that has been done in the last 2 or 3 years around the whole issue of stability, warfare, and trade is largely known. And I think I'd take it a step further and say the reason it's been there is because it's been the wrong stakeholders talking about it. But what has fundamentally changed, I think, in the last 2 years, in particular in the last 18 years, is that there's been a lot more attention from the states in these issues, trying to frame cyberspace not as this multi-stakeholder, abstract, global network, but rather something that has physical properties, jurisdictional properties, regulatory properties, and trying to address the regulation of that space and the use of force in that space through that framework itself. Norms can be set by consensus, but they can also be set by unilateral action. Here, especially in the States, if you look at the sort of plethora of events that talk about cybersecurity, it's clear that there's a wide gulf emerging between the academic community and its acolytes and those who are actually in the policy and operational and thinking about these issues. While I think it's been fine that the press has focused an awful lot on intellectual property theft and trade, I think we're looking at how Senator Congress and the Senate has positioned itself vis-a-vis cyberspace and very quietly and very distinctly as an utility with clear definition of powers, I think is a fairly major state in the sense that DoD now has a responsibility on the national level, national security level, for the defense of cyberspace, including what we consider to be civilian cyberspace, critical infrastructure, banking, trade sector, etc. Secondly, I think the debate that we've had up to now in terms of is cyberspace operations a Title 10 or PD 50 and can we define it under international law within those two frameworks is absolutely wrong. Take a look at counter-narcotics, taking a look at counter-proliferation, any of the issues of terrorism. These are Title 18, Title 50, Title 10. They shift, they're all of government response. And I think that's another thing that we're starting to see on the policy level, start to take a very coherent shape, which has not really been discussed or reflected on the academic discussions that we've had. So this new norm is coming, and I think to a large extent it's coming as a result of the fact that the coherence is starting to emerge within the U.S. geopolitics. Given the fact that the U.S. is the country that has, to a large extent, the most to gain and the most to lose from defining stability, warfare, and trade in cyberspace, it's only normal that that norm's propagation is going to be seen by the rest of the world by what goes on here in Washington. The question is what effect that's going to have on the global cyber environment. And I think here is the real nub of the issue. While I think that the rhetorical position, the ideological position that cyberspace maintains a multi-stakeholder, or remains a multi-stakeholder domain defined by that, is certainly something which fits extremely well with a conception of cyberspace that, generally speaking, favors the overall norms propagation that we've seen at play over the last 20 years, which has been very much North American centric, based upon a notion of freedom of expression, liberal access to information, etc. That does run contrary to cybersecurity stability, which ultimately has to be defined by national jurisdictions being able to implement national law over a territory, which in this case is synthetic, in the same way that it would over land, sea, and air. And that's a challenge, because how we maintain a norm of openness in internal governance while at the same time recognizing that stability, predictability, and trade are ultimately dependent on national jurisdictions are something that actually we have much more stake in trying to resolve than do, for example, the Chinese, the Russians, and others, for whom the notion of digital borders really is what they've argued for in the past decade.
Thank you. Something that just certainly from James and Mark, is saying that a lot of what we have is irrelevant. And again, just bringing the legal perspective and lawyers' mind. I think what we're talking about is norm emergence, and we need to have a consensus, right? There's common understanding about what constitutes responsible state behavior, etc. We have for years now, in a way, devaluated the whole international legal order by basically just letting everything be as it is, not invoking legal questions after Estonia, after even Georgia, after Stuxnet, etc. And so that to me tells us that this, from a legal perspective, yes, something has become irrelevant, and this irrelevance may have nothing to do with law itself. It has to do with political will. Now, the question I kind of derive from this for you is that, provided that we have a lot of irrelevant regulation, and we somehow need to fix the kind of next norms that will guide us better through this, then if there would be one, okay, two things that you could tomorrow either add to or take away from the existing legal order system, then you know what would this be? Well, actually, I was thinking of Rafal when asking this question, and I'm sure that others have ideas too.
No, I think Rafal is definitely the right person to answer.
It's a tough question, and I mean, I don't want to say that anything that's been done over the last 15 years has been relevant writ large, right? I think what I'd say is those who have been having the discussions in terms of considering what should be the applicability of laws of armed conflict to cyber aren't necessarily the people that were best positioned to do so, because they're not the ones that would actually have to do it. Moreover, they were doing it in isolation. So I would say that the criticism of something like the counter manual is that it didn't look at, for example, how we handle counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, counter-international, how do interagency-led interventions that blend different titles actually get executed. And that to me is a much more informed way of looking at how we deal with incidents in cyberspace that may on one hand reach the threshold, of national security response, and on the other hand may be something that is lesser than that and requires a different kind of response. We deal with actors who are not state actors. So it's I think more focusing the debate upon kind of a real life view of cyber rather than a kind of an abstraction of what we imagine.
But which you're basically saying that, I would say, based on what you say, that lawyers just needed to be a lot better job interpreting and kind of implementing the existing legal constructs in the light of what we're facing. Now, but I was still kind of read the question.
No, let me tackle that one, because I think there is, exactly as you've noted, the divorce between practice and some of the writing. And so if I was going to write a manual on cyber warfare or something, I would probably want to involve the people who've actually done that in some way. If you were going to compare, say, the Tallinn process to the Geneva Hague Conventions, the Pictet, who's and this is Catherine's thing, so this Swiss jurist led the group that wrote the commentaries on the Hague and Geneva Conventions on what we call laws of armed conflict, or international humanitarian law. He had an advantage because he had an actual convention to work off of, right? And the convention was drafted by people who had fought wars and knew they would be fighting wars in the future. And I think we lacked that experience, we lacked that framework of experience and activity to guide what we're thinking in cybersecurity. In some ways, we know that will change. This is going to happen. There will be the use of cyber techniques, and we can build on that experience. But we don't want to get too far ahead of the curve because we don't know what it's going to look like. There are ideas. If you know what some of the tests are, it'd be nice if other countries were a little more open about the doctrine. But we need to start basing the stuff we're writing on actual practice, the practice of espionage warfare.
Again, speaking from a technical point of view, the one thing I've noticed is that most cyber practitioners, the ones who are doing the day-to-day jobs, are in large part divorced from the idea of understanding the legal processes involved with the jobs they're doing on a daily basis. So if we're ever to sort of enact an active defense approach in an organization, which essentially means I'm now going to extend my reach beyond my physical network borders into some other country's borders to do some sort of action in order to prevent something from happening, I really do need to understand the legal constructs in place that will allow me to justify my action should something essentially occur because of what I just tried to accomplish.
Well, just kind of just to take the final version, but I really think that the kind of sense of no urgency in the way that has existed among the legal communities in this, not being compelled to be interdisciplinary in their thinking and reflection between the theory to reality will change after we meet this new standard of negligence. It doesn't matter if on national or international level. But from here, I have one other point that I'd like to raise, and this is, you mentioned the number of international organizations currently working on this issue. And my question is, what questions, what issues, what kind of messages do you think need to come from international level, as opposed to really national level, where I think the kind of the first order of getting your house in order needs to occur. If not, and I'm not mentioning companies, I mean, like, it starts with your computer, it starts with your business, and if we bring it to governments, then state versus international. What needs to be resolved on which level?
Off the top of my head, and I'd like to hear what the others have to say. I think there's two issues in particular that need to be resolved. And in other areas, you are seeing rough consensus, general consensus, and move towards consensus. There are borders in cyberspace. Attribution is a declining problem. Sovereignty applies. This is the framework that we're going to have to think of. And if you accept those three principles, and most countries do, that gives you a very different negotiating framework. But it still leaves open a whole set of issues, right? One is, what is the right structure for this? And the specific example would be the wicket and ITU, right? So there's so many countries that say that a global approach and international approach must be anchored in the UN. This is how we do international security. That's not the US position necessarily, but, and so I think what's the right structure, right? Do you approach it at a global level or a regional level? Again, I think the US position is that regional progress is more likely than some big overarching global convention. That's probably right. You do, and I think we've heard this issue-specific thing. You have a break it out into crime, the technical issues, and cert-to-cert cooperation that you try for some sort of big government approach. We need to figure that out. The two key problems for me are, again, the role of the other stakeholders. So you have the business community, the technical community, the internet community, all claiming a degree of jurisdiction on these issues. And claiming in some cases expertise on how to resolve them and figuring out how we fit these people in. The old days where we said, oh great, government's just one of the guys at the table and they don't have any particular role, those days are gone. And when you think about what it means to move from transatlantic to global, what it means is other people in the government. taking that into account, how do we adjust the multi-stakeholder model? Not give it up, adjust. The second one, this is a much more difficult issue, a much broader issue, but it comes up repeatedly, is national sovereignty versus universal rights. And I haven't quite thought my way through this one. So it'd be interesting to have a discussion. But at the end of World War II, the countries that survived that war in a victorious fashion decided the world would be more stable if we avoided some of the problems that come from dictatorships. If we avoided the political issues that we saw in the two of the three dictatorships we managed to beat in 1945. And the way to do that was to get a universal commitment to political rights for people. That universal commitment has now been questioned. It's being actively challenged by Russia and China, and by some others, including some that we thought were allies. And there's a larger debate about, well, if the Europeans and the Americans agreed to something 50 years ago or 60 years ago, does it really apply to us? And I've heard from many countries, our national law should take precedence. And the classic example is this Russian and Chinese code of conduct. It says, freedom of speech is guaranteed, comma, subject to national law. Well, no, Igor, it's not subject to national law, but that's the debate. So I think the two that are, there's a whole set of subsidiary issues. How do you organize this? How do you move forward? Is it regional or global? The two ones for me are adopting the multi-stakeholder model, the two most important are adopting the multi-stakeholder model, and then thinking about what do you do about universal rights? How do you accommodate, you raised this a minute or something. How do you accommodate cybersecurity and at the same time preserve these universal rights? It was a long answer, sorry.
Yeah, I'll give not an answer, but maybe a soliloquy to your response. We sometimes forget history. When I was reading around the subject of definition of public good, I came across an interesting fact. That in the early part of the last century, when automobiles were first introduced into the roadways of the United Kingdom, who was responsible for setting road signs and roads? Do you know?
Well, automotive.
Exactly. Because it was best felt that the users, the drivers themselves, would be best able to define what was the collective public good in terms of regulating road. I put to you that that's kind of where we are in this whole debate of who governs cyberspace and internet. Is that we're trying to grasp who is best placed to be able to define what is the public good and to act on the public good. The problem I think we run into is that on one hand we deal with these universal norms, which we have to face to some extent are reflective of our societies. That have been the societies that have to some extent birthed the internet in almost 20 years, in the States, Europe, and elsewhere. That does run contrary with the kind of providing the prevailing ways of conversation and others. It also, I think, is interesting that what is best for being able to define the public good and implement cybersecurity at a level where there is a congruence between jurisdiction and capability actually falls in the nation state level. It doesn't scale to the global level. And that runs contrary to our position on the universalization of norms and the multi-stakeholder approach. And that's a problem. I think that is a problem and a challenge. You asked the question earlier from a legal perspective, what could change from the debates around it? If you extend legality into regulation, the one thing that is being not talked about, which is probably the most important criteria for solving what I would say the 80% problem in terms of cybersecurity, is the role and relevance of telecommunications carriers and hence telecommunication regulation at the national level in terms of compelling security. And that's why is that the case? We have this notion that somehow cyberspace is disembodied from its physical infrastructure. Number one. Secondly, that internet service providers are disembodied from telecommunications carriers. And in fact, in the last 15 years, that's exactly what is not. Where ISPs have become telcos and telcos have become ISPs. The enough intelligence is going back into the network rather than being copied from outside of it. It's at the telco level where the infrastructure, the hardware of provision of network services, where the virtual capabilities for making it operate, and where the regulatory environment actually come together with stakeholders. And yet we haven't really used or compelled that mechanism as a means of being able to implement, which is something which is much simpler to do with, for example, compelling information sharing with companies, to deal with sort of 80% problem of insecurity
not sure I have much to add to those comments.
Well, thank you. I checked the box on file, and I think it's a good time to open it up for questions, because I'm sure you have questions and so well, there's a microphone in the room, so I think.
Thank you. In decades past, issues of conventional arms control for space, there's in 1967 aerospace treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons in orbit. To move to a conventional domain, there have been a lot of efforts through multiple administrations. It's been very difficult to come up either with treaties or rules of the road, in part because of verification issues, in part because some technologies that can be useful for defense also can be useful for offense, and in part because nation states, including our own, need flexibility for various sorts of things. When you look at cyber, it seems very similar to space. Extremely difficult to verify sorts of things. We need to have flexibility, the capability of forming defensive technologies and techniques to be used for offensive purposes. Is there really any better hope for cyber agreed rules of the road, much less treaties? Is there any hope that's any better than it has been for space?
I'll go first, and then, because I've been working on this one, not particularly well, but at least working. And I think there's two key differences that make me more positive on this cyberspace. First of all, I'd be interested in the reaction of my colleagues. I think attribution is a problem of declining significance, whereas in space, attribution will continue to be a problem. So you're seeing a split where the ability to attribute is increasing rapidly in cyberspace. At these meetings I was in Beijing, one of the panels was explicitly on anonymity and attribution, and no one, these included vice minister, other Chinese officials, no one disagreed that attribution is a declining problem, or that we have the ability to attribute attacks in cyberspace. So that's a significant difference. The second one is asymmetry. Americans have lots of satellites. It's what we would call a target-rich environment for reforming. And it's so tempting. Why not shoot them or do whatever you're going to do to them? Because there's just so many of them. You're going to miss. Whereas I'm much less dependent on space. Right? And the cyber realm, that may change over time, but currently there's an asymmetry in targeting. Right? Multiple American targets, relatively few foreign targets. Tremendous American dependence, much less foreign dependence. And in cyber, that's not the case. And everyone is more dependent and increasingly dependent on cyberspace. One of the interesting things about this conference that was 2 days ago was the Chinese said, oh, we used to think there was an asymmetry, but we're as dependent as you know on cyberspace. So I think when you put that in, ability to attribute and the symmetry in targeting, that gives you grounds for optimism that you could eventually reach some level of agreement.
Economically speaking, I think that countries are now realizing that there's a tremendous gain if they would just work together to create these rules of engagement, to try to deconflict a lot of the, I'm trying to think of a better word than crap, but a lot of the stuff that is taking place on a day-to-day basis that's costing us to spend tremendous amounts of money for very little benefit. And so in that case, I think countries would be incentivized to promote good rules of engagement, good behavior on the cyberspace. And then the question makes me think of the deterrence side as well. And deterrence is sort of a tough problem, right? Because how do you deter a nation or anyone from acting in cyberspace? And maybe we can look for groups like Anonymous, which kind of do some interesting things, right? So speaking specifically about an action 2.5 weeks ago at a Python conference where someone takes a picture, tweets it, and then from that ends up a denial of service attack by Anonymous, and people get fired. But you can read about the story, but in essence, the point is that you have a group that is essentially promoting good behavior, saying, don't do that. If you do that, we take exception with that, and next year we're going to attack them for it. So you have this sort of really big threshold of action on their part, but it's a very interesting case to look at.
Yeah, I'd say three things. First of all, I very much agree with Jim about the fact that attribution is a declining problem. And I think it is a declining problem, partially because of the fact that we are now getting much better at applying a cross-domain analytical approach to doing attribution rather than simply focusing on technical names, which have pain points to increasing. On the other hand, I'd say two other things. I think at the same time as attribution problems declining, we are seeing a problem of proliferation capabilities. And that, I think, is going to stay with us for quite a while and is going to actually act against the ability of people to come up with global conventions in the way that we come up with global conventions, for example, chemical weapons, or nuclear weapons, and others. I view weaponization of cyber very much in the way that we look at small arms. It's a small arms problem that is going to be very, very difficult to be able to control and flow and what groups have access to. I think also we're facing a challenge that the threshold for use of these weapons is going to be starting to decline. In other words, it's going to be easier to use these weapons at lower thresholds of conflict. And I point here to why I think this. To one of the lessons learned of Stuxnet, which a lot of people do not pay attention to. That's the fact that the way that the Stuxnet code operated actually proved that we could weaponize and target, or have a target to be used for something. Why? Because it clearly separated the code from booster phase and propagation phase of the warhead phase. The propagation phase is found all over the world. Satellites in India, broadcasters in Canada, power plants around the world. But the warhead code, that which actually created the near kinetic effect, only targeted within a very specific area. And I think that's a very, very important threshold to be used. Because legally what it meant is that these weapons could be employed through public networks, could leave traces, essentially the shell casing, but that the effects could also be legally defined and kinetically defined within a very, very specific time. That really was the Rubicon that prior to this time was never really proven. Tesla was never really proven. And I think the lesson has not been lost in both peer competitors in the nation state in this space as well as those others in the nation state space.
Good morning, John Marshall. It strikes me that the use of the term stability in cyberspace is actually some legacy thinking that's formed by our mindset. And everything, including the last 2 points that you made there, regarding the proliferation of the capability and then this lowering of the threshold. Even from that snapshot, one could posit that stability is completely unrealistic. And to take stability in cyberspace as a basic tenet of the approach now is merely a reiteration of the cold war mindset. We need to take a different frame to accept that instability, driven by this proliferation and lowering of thresholds, is going to make this more an issue of management, not containment or stability.
Well, I agree, but again, I'd like to sort of step back a bit. I think one of the realities that we should come accustomed to is that as more and more of the global population become dependent on cyber for their personal lives, for their social lives, for their economic lives, the more this space is going to start reflecting society at large. Now, in any society at large, you have a certain percentage which is pretty general. In any society, you have instability which is caused by a variety of different factors. And that is the new normal. I think that there's kind of this mistake that's sometimes made that cyberspace is going to be different than any other space of human activity. We have a tremendous amount of instability within the international system brought about by narcotics, state hollowing, state failure, you name it. And yet somehow we manage to regulate or manage or live within those parameters. Sometimes they're worse, sometimes they're better, but there is a kind of equilibrium that's found. I think that bubble, that equilibrium is also going to become in cyberspace, it's just we don't know where it is. So we panic about the exceptions without realizing that there's going to be kind of a new normal that we're going to live with, that is going to have, as we have at present, 15% of all machines on the internet owned or compromised by either criminal or espionage type target, where 5% of the internet is not functional because of denial of service attacks. Another 2% is not functional because of acts of God, whatever it may be. Another 3% happens to be inoperable because of workman's competence. And so,
Yeah, I generally agree that we need to get away from the Cold War mode of thinking. One of my new tests is if you say cyber deterrence, you really need to take a close look. It doesn't make any sense. And all these, a bunch of, I was about to make a defense science book joke, but I'll skip it. But it's not like nuclear war, it's not the Cold War, it's all this stuff. Well, none of that stuff really works that way. That said, governments around the world are now deeply concerned about this, and we need to find some way to reassure governments that this isn't going to spin out of control into some more damaging kind of conflict, which is what they're doing. So I think it's redefining stability, not using the Cold War notions. And so for a long time I was sort of pursuing what is strategic stability in cyberspace, which is the Cold War thing. It was a fruitless quest. But you can define stability and think of ways to make governments feel more confident. One of the issues, and I'd be interested in other people's point of views, one of the issues for me that the ability to better attribute gives you is I think we can now say at this time the most dangerous actors in cyberspace are nation states on a significantly greater scale than any private group. Right? And so the ability to cause physical destruction is limited to nation states. The ability to cause widespread destruction is currently limited to nation states. Not entirely sure why, but if nation states are the most dangerous actors, and that can be shown quantitatively, then that lets us put it into a framework where we can talk about international stability. It's consistent with what we've been saying. What we've been saying all along on this panel.
I just add to that, to what Jim is saying, I absolutely agree with the notion that nation states are the most dangerous actors. And I think here it's important to understand the distinction between cyber espionage and cyber crime. Technically, they're virtually distinguishable. And if you look at what Stuxnet represented in terms of software code, it's like a Frankenstein amalgam of the best practice of cyber crime. Difference is that the ability to put Stuxnet on target required domain expertise. And that domain expertise could only be gotten through national technical capabilities of a nation state. And I think the same goes if you're talking about the destructive and disruptive capabilities employed through, we're just speaking cyber warfare. You need the domain expertise. You need to have the motivation to be able to create those kinds of things.
And sorry. Yeah, I lost it. That's okay. There's a question.
Yeah, Bill Stallsville from PwC. I just have a question I'd like to have for the panel's comments on recent U.S. government initiatives in the area of cybersecurity. How effectively, specifically the executive order issued in February by the White House and the bill working its way through Congress, which passed out of committee yesterday. Whether these will be effective and how this might contribute to efforts to reach the international consensus you're talking about. Thank you.
I can just basically I'm not from here, so in essence, I haven't followed the instruments themselves, but kind of a more generic remark on this. I think more and more countries are facing the kind of situation where they need to figure out what's the kind of best approach of regulating. And this, the fact that really cybersecurity as such gets divided as a mandate between different authorities, and therefore often you need to engage on, let's say, parliamentary level to get to pushing regulation through. We're seeing this all over the world that it is really difficult to get consensus on that level of how to regulate. And that's the kind of effect of that is that everything that comes out of the parliament is so generic, but it's so generally worded that it goes down again to those pillars, to those individual institutions to make sense. And I'd say that one of the recent documents that kind of proves the case again is this, the European Union cybersecurity strategy. Because if you read that document, you will see that the pillars are not abolished. The kind of the pillars, that means the different authorities who see very different priorities and how to approach this are still there. So in that sense, I just really sympathize with the fact that you need to find alternative ways of kind of putting the regulation out there and starting to do something about this.
On the executive order, I think it was a very positive step, but there's considerable risk in its implementation that is as yet unclear whether it will lead to a good outcome. I would point to the example of Australia, which has been in a couple areas a leader in dealing with this problem, both in their work through the Attorney General's office on a cooperative framework for dealing with botnets, dealing with service providers, and maybe something about that. One that's attracted less attention is the Australian Defence Signals Directorate, which is their equivalent of NSA, has developed a list of 35 mitigation strategies. If you look, and I've talked extensively with a number of Australian colleagues from multiple agencies, they will tell you that if you simply implement the first 4 of these mitigation strategies, it will reduce risk by 85%. In other words, it will reduce successful attacks by 85%. That's simply astounding. This is not rocket science. So we can now begin to identify whether the NIST process produces something as concrete and effective as these very concise Australian mitigation strategies remains to be seen. The NIST approach, one of the reasons NIST was selected was the NIST process is very open. They had a comment period. It was still technically closed on the first, but they're still accepting comments. And they got comments that range from, brush your teeth every morning to here's how to build a nuclear weapon, how they would boil that into something useful. Some of you are shaking your heads no. I have total faith. But the second, on the CISPA one, just very quickly, I think you're talking about the launchers from the perspective bill. Very good bill. It does some things we absolutely need to do. The laws that govern information sharing were designed in the 1980s. They're clearly out of date. The one area of concern is that last year that bill was used as an excuse for not doing anything more encompassing on cybersecurity. And depending on who you talk to, they would say either we know it's not enough, but it's the only thing that's politically feasible, or if they were talking to a business audience, they would say, support our bill and we'll protect you from regulation. So CISPA, a good bill, we need it, it's not enough. CISPA and the executive order together, if you got a good outcome, that would be a good positive step, but we'll still need legislation. So some good steps towards progress, but until we see them completed, we don't know if we're working.
I won't say anything about CISPA, since I'm also a non-US citizen. But I will say about the executive order, I think we need to look at it in context with a number of separate policy initiatives that have been taken across the government. And I think that reflects the fact that there has been an emerging consensus, which is not within its way into this around the fact that responses to cyber events have to be gradated, and by nature will always be an all-of-government response. And therefore, the executive order simply give yet another capability with defining response.
I know my thought before I was present to this. The question for about stability, right? And how to measure stability. What does stability even look like for us? And we have these questions that I want a situational awareness view of my infrastructure, my domain landscape, what things look like. It's very tough to sort of create that in the cyberspace. right? Because as you said, we do have these known actors, we do know they exist, we do know what they're up to as far as the TTPs, and in large part we can accept that on a daily basis. It doesn't necessarily affect the fact that I can still maintain my own business operations, because I know about these things. But then that gets into the guidance that is put forth in regards to regulation. Prescriptive guidance on how to do things generally hasn't worked very well through the years. Sharing of defensive TTPs has worked very, very well through the years. And to Jim's point, the sharing of these mitigation strategies, it's not telling you step by step how to do something. It's telling you if you do these things and you thoughtfully think through how to do them in the right way, then indeed you will reap the benefits from it. But ultimately, what we find sharing-wise, sharing information is a very vague word, a sort of term used by countries, used by organizations, used by everybody. And what we find is that I don't want to share information with you. I want to share with you insights. I want to share with you perspective, and I'm really to a thought point. I want to share with you the domain perspective of this particular incident, how it affected me, who it was that was trying to do this to me, and really be able to describe their TTPs to you, so that way, next time something happens, you can recognize these particular behavioral actions. And that's really what we're going to see a lot of gains in cybersecurity in the future, when we move away from the idea of prescriptive, specific guidance of how to do something, and really say, I'm putting you responsible for your, how are you going to play the game? Are you good enough to be on the field?
We have 3 hands up. Let's take those 3 questions.
Hi, Chris Haley. I'm a student at Georgetown University. Thanks a lot for your insightful comments today. This may be something that's widely known, but I personally am not aware of it. So I was curious, you were talking about the biggest threat these days is from nation states. I was wondering if you'd be able to kind of give your opinion on the actual magnitude of that threat. Obviously, we talk about, bringing down the power grid and stuff like that. And to me, I would think if I was an energy company, I would want my systems somewhat isolated. So it seems a little strange that that would be a threat, but perhaps it is. I was curious if you could just reflect on the magnitude of the threat that we're looking at. Thank you.
Follow up on what he said, are you guys familiar with Shodan?
Yeah. I wish you hadn't said that, but it's too late now, isn't it?
Yeah, add that to his question.
If you say Metasploit, then we're in real trouble.
Sorry, you're in.
Peter Topichka, Carnegie Moscow Center Foundation. And the question is, for, if I'm not mistaken, for the United States, Russia and China play a biggest role in talks on cybersecurity. From this point of view, how could you describe the current status of the confidence and building measures if these measures are possible with the talks between China and Russia? And what is your opinion about what its current stage should the messages to Moscow Beijing in this context? Thank you.
Okay. And then there is
Hi, I'm Trey. We've all touched on sort of the jurisdiction question, the sovereignty question a couple of times. I'm just curious, do you see sovereignty as being defined over data or networks? Data or network? Sovereignty over data or sovereignty over network?
So I'll start with the flipped question. Anyone?
Well, I mean, I'll start maybe by saying, echoing something that Jim said, which I think needs to be said over and over and over again. Cyber weapons are not equivalent to nuclear weapons. Okay, there is no equivalency there. You cannot look at them in that kind of category. The way that we need to look at cyber is something which is going to be integrated overall in the posture of projecting force. It will become a way of warfare rather than just a means of warfare. And I think that's very, very important to understand. That when we talk about cyber warfare, sometimes I have the sense of somebody saying, well, we have howitzer warfare. We have, M4 warfare. We don't. That's a tool for applying force in a particular context, in a particular way. And that's the way I think we need to start looking at the employment of cyber capabilities writ large. And I think that's the way that, frankly, the genomics and here and Cybercom are thinking about it. It's just that, on our level, and the level of sort of popular culture, we still kind of see it as being exceptional. And I think largely because of the fact that we kind of defined what we mean by cyber warfare by the exploits of Anonymous, and by what we saw in Georgia, what we saw in Stone Age, I think is the exception rather than the actual practice. On the question of content and networks, and that's great that you say that, we define it, or we should define it in terms of networks, I think, because that's where the jurisdictional rights and ability to be able to regulate security actually work. The Russians and the Chinese are very much focused on the content networks. We talked about information security, right, and not cyber security, because they look at things. What we're sometimes going through is the fact that if you look at broadcasting, we do apply content regulations to broadcasts. They do fit within industrial jurisdiction or boundaries. The fact that we don't apply it to the internet is actually an exception to our own practice, one which is not going unnoticed by either Moscow and Beijing, particularly in the context of the wicked, the conventions, the norms that have been public. I'd say also one other small comment. Although there's a great deal of still debate among establishing the norms of interstate relations vis-a-vis cyber, on the functional level, you have a lot of collaboration. And where you see the most collaboration is between the telecommunications carriers, because they're the ones that actually deal with cyber incidents that fall beneath a certain threshold on a daily basis. So China Telecom and MTS and Rostelecom collaborate a heck of a lot more than the Russians and the Chinese do, even within the framework of the SCO. AT&T, Bell Canada collaborate an awful lot more with China Telecom in terms of dealing with some of the issues that hit core aspects of their networks than do any bilateral discussions in terms of establishing norms of how to deal with something. So there's a functional level and there's a political level, and I think we have to distinguish between the two.
So I'll add on the nation state threat side. I think the question ends up being, what is the motivation of the nation state? Really, what's the threat? Obviously, the most capable adversaries are the ones who are able to do more nefarious things, but really, what are they trying to accomplish? And I think that's what we have to sort of focus on, right? I don't think, a nation state taking out of power is necessarily going to be looked upon very well by the international community, right? So while there may be about a fear and uncertainty June around this taking place, we obviously understand that the nation state capabilities are more focused on them gaining some sort of economic advantage as far as international relations goes. How can they actually support a financial network? How can they actually be able to protect property? Those are things that we sort of worry about. And that goes back to the question of how to promote better behavior by all countries in these problems.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the point Rafael made that if you're going to criticize the DoD effort to define cyber as a domain, then you can say you can have naval warfare, air warfare, cyber warfare. And that, in some ways, it's a little misleading because it is more like a new source of fire to direct against targets. And in deciding how to use that source of fire, I think nations will largely use the same processes they have now for making decisions. So when is it in China's interest to launch a missile strike against the US? They have a process for making that decision. Some cases it will be attractive, in most cases it won't be attractive at all. They think, as far as I can tell, and this would be true for other state adversaries, they think largely in this way. Iran and North Korea are a little more problematic, and one of the dilemmas is not only do we not have good insight into how they make decisions on the use of force, but the way they calculate risk and make decisions is sufficiently different from how powers like Russia and China calculate risk that's a concern. So they may very well come to a decision to use this new form of attack without having thought through all the consequences. That's one of the things I worry about. But it would be nice if electric companies can connect their stuff, their control systems to the internet, and perhaps someday in the happy future we will get to that point. A good example to think about is you're a line supervisor, and one of your jobs is to drive your truck and get out and check remote facilities. It's raining like it was raining this morning. What if I just put a wireless device in the remote facility? Now I don't have to get out in the truck. And that's just like a low-level decision, you need to tell your management about that. So in surveys that people have done, we've found that companies believe they have shielded their control system from the internet. In every case, that is not proven to be the case. And in every case, they don't know all the devices on their own network. These are some of the things that some of the Australian guys are getting at. And so if you were taking notes, someone mentioned Showdown. Then I blurted out Metasploit, which is a very nice suite of tools. And there's another one called Wireshark, which will let you go into wireless networks. You can build this at home. It's kind of fun. Now, how much you're going to be able to do is a different matter. On Russia and China, I think the debate now in the international community is, again, how far do you want to pursue a global solution that involves all state participants, and maybe all multi-stakeholders, and how far do you want to go along the lines of like-minded? That's what we did in proliferation. You just say, there's a point where you reach and say, approaching a global solution working through the UN gives powers of veto, in effect, over progress. And if you say, hey, nice to know, thanks a lot, catch up to us when you can, and move ahead on a like-minded basis. But this is an open debate point. I'm not sure it's a public debate point, it's probably a mistake, but that's a better way to think about this is, when do we begin to move along the path of like-minded nations?
It's very sad to wrap it up. I think it's been a really good conversation, and so just a few things that I took away from this one myself is that I very much like the phrase or the recommendation, we need to sharpen the research. And I think we need to sharpen our minds when thinking about this, because it is easy to get carried away with analogies to nuclear threat and Cold War and everything. And we all kind of need to justify our place in this discussion and kind of in the solution, because at the end of the day, yes, it will be a global solution idea, but before it will be a global solution, it will be a regional solution, it will be a national solution, it will be a business entity solution, it will be an individual solution, and in that way, we are part of the solution, each one of us. I also very much kind of agree that any proscripts or kind of prescription is difficult to craft in this field. And once, this discussion we had actually earlier this morning with Chris, I think we need to come back to this very simple concept of new normal. Meaning this is the case, and let's use what we've got instead of focus on what we don't yet have, even if it's clarity, even if it's a norm. So we have put gangsters away, even when we don't have evidence against them. We can use other existing legal frameworks. We can think of taxis, we can think of banking rules, we can think of telco rules, and just put it in the context, and then use what we have instead of what we're missing. And the kind of standard or thought I think we all need to implement is the fact exactly why would someone want to help us if we don't help ourselves in this field? So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming. And I actually very much hope that there will be new sessions like this in ISS and actually more in this field, because I think not everything has to take a day or 2 days to figure out the own conversations. Thank you very much.